Thanks very much, Dave, and thanks everybody at the LSE end. Just want to welcome everybody here to this afternoon discussion with our old friend from LSE Ideas, Ian Morris. Welcome, Ian. Very good to see you again. I could say welcome back to LSE Ideas because Ian was Philip Roman professorship with us some years ago, not too long ago, and was very successful, great lectures in person, which was nice, talking in and around the great theme of his then great book, Why the West Rules for Now. Ian is a kind of, I'd almost call you a dissident historian, Ian, who does the long term, the big picture. And I wouldn't say there's no dates in sight, there's lots of dates, but it is that big picture analysis that you bring to bear on the subject. And very fortunately, of course, Ian, of course, is based at the Hoover over there on the west coast of the United States. Has written a big book again, another big book, Ian. You've got to stop writing these big books, you know, but nonetheless, congratulations. It's about geography and geography as destiny, which kind of looks at the very complex relation between Britain and the continent of Europe, and whether or not the Brexit was foreordained, or whether it was accidental, whether it was just a consequence of a bad campaign. But I think Ian has tried to suggest that the relationship between what we now call Britain, or Great Britain, particularly this side of the British Isles, the UK part of it, without Ireland, of course, and even without Northern Ireland, it has always had a complicated and complex relationship with Europe, with mainland Europe, ever since the two geographically separated thousands of years ago. This is almost a 10,000-year history, and the ambition you display is highly commendable, but also I think brings up some very exciting conclusions and brings a perspective which I think is often missed in the Brexit debate over here, because so much of it focuses, I think, as you suggest, on the short term, whereas in fact what we should be looking at is this complex long-term relation, and particularly the importance of geography in shaping, if not overly determining, the relationship between these islands over here and the mainland continent of Europe. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail to introduce Ian. He should be well known to all of our viewers out there, to all of our listeners as well. He's on the west coast of the United States at Hoover. He's just written this very large book now, again, a bestseller with many great puffs or endorsements by some very great people, many of whom have been associated with LSE Ideas over the years. So Ian, I'm not going to go into any more detail. That's enough from me. Welcome again to LSE Ideas. And the first question I'm going to ask you is, tell me why you wrote this book in the way in which you did. And it's almost like a PhD exam, this one, Ian, although you've already passed your PhD several times over. What do you think it brings to the table in terms of the debate about Britain and Europe? So Ian, lovely to see you again, and I look forward to your comments. And we'll have a conversation for a while and then pass on to people who've tuned in. Ian, over to you.
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me back to the LSE. It's great to be with you again virtually. Sad not to be there in person. I had such a good time when I was with you as a Philip Roman professor, but at least I can be with you from the comfort of my own home now. And I should apologize in advance. I've got the dogs in here with me, so at some point they might start going nuts and have a little bit, but they're usually pretty good. But anyway, yeah, thank you for having me back. And thanks also to everybody who made my previous visit such a good one, to Amelia, if she's there, and Christopher Coker, if he's around, and to Dave and Melania as well for making sure everything is working correctly on this. Okay, so and to all, of course, everybody out there for coming along to watch and listen. So yeah, so why did I write this book? Well, like Mick was just saying, I started out as a fairly conventional historian, archaeologist of the ancient world, working on ancient Greece. And I found back when I was doing my PhD thesis still, and actually a long time since I did my PhD defense, and I hope this actually doesn't go like that did. But when I was writing my PhD thesis, I found that if I sort of enlarged the scale of the things I was looking at, different kind of answers started to emerge and occur to me to solve the problems I was looking at. And this went on for some time. The bigger the time span, the bigger the geographical span, the more possible explanations I could see for what was going on. But then I got to a certain point about 15, 20 years ago when I realized, actually enlarging the scale up toward the global, the super long term, I'm getting to be more interested now in the really big questions themselves, rather than using the big scale to answer the local question. It's the big questions that interest me. So I wrote several books about this and had a really good time doing it, but kept thinking while I was writing these books that, interested as I am in the big picture, the actual history is still being made by actual people, real people living their lives. And these great big theories, they're not very much help to anyone unless they can be brought back down to earth to explain specific things that happen. And so I thought, I should write a book about that at some point, and kind of never did anything. And then in your wisdom, the British people voted to decide to leave the European Union back in 2016. And I woke up the next day and looked at the results, which slightly surprised me, and thought, that's it. Now, this is a perfect test case for the kind of thing I've been doing. Can I bring these 10,000-year global scale theories back down to bear on a specific incident that actually help us understand what happened in the real world? And well, you will be shocked to learn, I came to the conclusion, yes. Otherwise I wouldn't have this book, and I wouldn't be here evening with you, wouldn't be here this evening talking about it. So yeah, that's how I got into this.
What did you want to prove, and who did you want to prove it against, Ian, if that's not an unfair question? Getting you into a polemic early.
Yeah, well, when I started out, I knew I'd said I'm going to write this book, but I didn't actually have a very clear idea of what I was trying to prove or who I was trying to prove it against at the beginning. And that sort of emerged as I got into it. And I realized, as I usually do in a writing book, I realized I have many enemies out there, all of whom are terribly wrong and must be made to realize this. And so one of the enemy groups was historians who just take a very short-term view of everything, often produce very, very insightful history, because by taking a small topic, you can really go down deep, burrow to the bottom, investigate all of the facts. But I felt that the people who were just looking at the last 10, 15 years or so really were missing what was going on here. That Brexit, it's just the latest chapter in a very, very long-term story, going back 10,000 years. So this became the group of people I was largely arguing against. And I must say, as I got writing, one of the people, the groups I thought I was arguing against, I realized I kind of wasn't exactly. And when I started writing, like a lot of people like me, people who've got higher degrees and flit around the world on airplanes and live in California, but come and be their Roman lecturer in London, I just sort of took it for granted. Well, of course, every right-thinking person will want to stay in the European Union. How can you not want to do that? But almost as soon as I got working on the book, I realized there's just a lot more to it than this, that it's not like everybody, half the population collectively went mad in 2016 and voted to leave the EU. They were actually taking part in this much, much longer discussion, and very little in what was said on either side in 2016 was new. These things go back at least 2,000 years to the oldest connected discussion we've got of British attitudes about the wider world, written by the Roman historian Tacitus, roughly 2,000 years ago. And a lot of the things being said in 2016, Tacitus was already saying these things about the concerns about identity and mobility and prosperity and security and sovereignty. It all goes back 2,000 years, and looking at the archaeological record, if we're interpreting this rightly, probably the same debates have been going on for 10,000 years. So I realize, these debates, to have lasted that long, to be going that seriously, and to have roughly half the electorate vote on each side, that almost certainly means there's something to be said for both these arguments. So, and we need to understand what it is.
Is it that when you say geography is destiny, are you suggesting, I just want to get clarification on this, that therefore the sheer geographical position of Britain historically, which can't be changed, however much people might like to change it, but let's just call it for the moment a fixed thing on the planet Earth, with the channel between us and the rest of Europe. When you say geography is destiny, are you therefore saying the likelihood of something like Brexit emerging was more likely than less likely because of geography? Is that your thesis or not? I just want to get you to tease that out a bit more.
Sure, yeah, my answer to that, a resounding yes and no. Perhaps all of the above. That the thing, I mean, it's easy to say something like geography is destiny, very straightforward. I think most of us have a sort of rough idea of what that should mean. But it gets a lot more complicated, because while geography drives history, history also drives what geography means. And so as societies change, which is driven in large part by their geographical position in the world, as societies change, the meaning of that geography is changing along with them. And this, I realized, this sort of explains the larger British story. One of the amazing things about British history and archaeology is there's just so much of it. And in quality as well as quantity, it really is quite amazing. It's one of the jewels of the British accomplishments, this academic industry we've created, analyzing ourselves. Huge amount of stuff, tremendously complicated, all kinds of things going on. And yet, when you start thinking about it in the long term, and looking at a geographical framework, one of the things I realized quite early on is that British history really just goes through three phases, which are driven by three successive sets of meanings of geography. And like you say, the physical geography, that hasn't changed all that much since, I mean, the waters more or less stopped rising by about 6,000, 5,000 BCE. After the end of the Ice Age, glaciers melt, and Britain is cut off from the continent by rising waters. The British Isles become the British Isles, so between 10,000 and 8,000 BC. Geography then physically more or less stops changing, but its meaning carries on changing. And so almost the whole of the British story, I'd say from 10,000 BC up till just about 500 years ago, the basic meaning of British geography was that Britain was an extension of the continent. So, I mean, the two core facts haven't changed. British Isles are still isles, and they're still very close to the continent. The English Channel is only, 21 miles wide. So they're very close to the continent. But the longest story has been driven by this kind of back and forth, this dance between what these two facts of insularity and proximity, what they mean given the state of the societies at the time.
So what then changes it in about circa 1500, which in the way you use history, of course, is a mere tick in the history box, isn't it? The 10,000 year span, I love that. But what then changes to change the perception, if I get you right on this, Ian, where people are no longer regarding the British Isles or Britain as an extension of the continent? Is it to do with the Reformation, England becoming quote unquote a Protestant nation? Is it to do with our various wars, first against Spain and then against France as the two dominant European powers? Or is there something else also going on which leads us to that second phase in perception of geography, which I find a very fascinating idea, that it is a fixed fact. On the other hand, there's a construction of geography and a construction of the relationship between the British Isles and the continent. So I'd like to hear your words on that.
Yeah, well, basically all of the things you mentioned, and then a lot more as well, all of these feed in there. But seems to me that the fundamental story, and this is not just about British history, this is about everyone's history everywhere, is that your story is driven by your geography, but your geography is constantly changing meanings. And two big things really affect what the geography means, I think particularly in the British case. And one of these is technology, and especially the kind of technologies involved in travel across the water, communication across the water. So like maritime, especially technologies, is one of the things. The other big thing is organization, and the kind of structures and organizations you've got in place to use the various tools that are at your disposal. So, obviously a bunch of stuff happens between 10,000 BC and 500 years ago, 1500 CE. Bunch of stuff happens. But the basic meanings of geography don't change all that much, because right across that period, you're dealing with fairly low levels of technology and fairly simple organizations, especially on the government side, the money raising, spending side. And these low levels of technology and organization, what they mean is that the modern strategic concept of the command of the oceans, that is just meaningless up till about 500 years ago, because anybody who can get to the continental side of the English Channel can cross across to the English side as well, unless you get in a storm, your ship sinks or something, which obviously does happen. But basically, the Channel is a highway, not a barrier, because of the levels of technology and organization. Now, what happens about 500 years ago? Well, two big things happened. First of all, the technologies start to change. People are building more and more sophisticated ships until you get basically the kind of ships we now call galleons, ships that could stay at sea for months at a time, which raises, at least in theory, the possibility you could use these ships to blockade enemies in their ports. Suddenly, maybe you can control the seas. Maybe you can close the English Channel against the continent. So that's one of the big things you've got to have is these new ships. The other big thing you've got to have, though, is organizations able to raise enough money to build a lot of these ships and then keep them at sea for months or years at a time. And that's actually more of the problem than the technology, because an organization big enough and strong enough, a government able to build these sorts of fleets, it's also a government that is able to reach into your pocket and take all the money you've made and take it away from you and spend it on their warships. And people in England above all this, right? People in England do not like this, and there's intense resistance to this. And a lot of the most famous events in English history in the 16th, 17th centuries are basically arguments about, is this what we want? Do we want a government able to reach into our pockets, take our money, build a fleet that can close the channel, keep out the Spaniards and to some extent the French as well? And also, do we want a government hand in hand with these merchants who are able to take the same technologies, same kinds of organization that are used to close the channel and simultaneously open the oceans? So this new vision gets going in England in the middle of the 16th century. We can close the channel and open the oceans. Behind a closed channel, well, behind what Shakespeare called it a moat defensive. And it's like, it's no coincidence. Shakespeare is the first poet to start using this sort of language as the English Channel as a barrier. Because 100 years earlier, it just made no sense. So Mallory, Chaucer, guys like this, they would never talk about a moat defensive. But the new vision is we can close the channel, make it a moat defensive, open the oceans, defeat the Spaniards on the high seas by cutting off their silver supply from the New World, and then go on to create this global empire. We can engross the trade of the world, is what people started saying in the 16th century. And it's a radically new vision of what England particularly is all about. So secure behind the moat defensive, England will gobble up the whole of the British Isles into a single kingdom run from London, which had never happened before, engross the trade of the world, become a world power, and basically give up like a second tier place on a European stage and exchange it for a first ranked place on a global stage. So it's a strategic vision of kind of breathtaking boldness. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of doubt and anxiety about this. And we got really 150, you think Brexit is bad. You think of 5 or 6 years of arguing about, oh, was this a good idea? You have no idea how bad this could be. Until they start burning Remainers at the stake in the middle of London. This is all child's play. So it's like Brexit, but way, way more so.
Let me pick you up, though. It's a very materialist interpretation, and I don't use that as a criticism, but I think it, in essence, is, if I might say so. Where does religion, I mean, I'm bound to, I was taught by a number of historians who would always emphasize, the Reformation, Britain as a Protestant nation, and the way that Protestantism itself became, in essence, the kind of unifying ideology of the British Isles once the Welsh had been absorbed. I lived in Wales for many years, so I know much about that. After Scotland had become part of the Union, and indeed Ireland, of course, was part of a united kingdom until partition in the 1920s. How much of that did religion play any part in that? Because I used to have a lot of friends who'd say, that Protestantism became the ideology both of the unification of the islands rather, excluding, of course, Catholics by definition, who became the enemy within and without. And of course, Catholic Europe, therefore, could be easily seen as the enemy without, which could then make alliances with the Catholic enemy within. How much of the religious aspect linked to the strategic would you actually stress in your analysis, which focuses very much more on the maritime and the organizational and those various things? Not that they're unimportant, far from it. I just want to see where you would put that particular factor in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that you don't consider calling me a materialist to be an insult, because
No,
a
not
lot
in the
of my colleagues do.
least.
But yeah, no, I am a proud materialist. And back when I was an undergraduate, one of my teachers told me, if you can't find a material explanation for what you're looking at, you're not looking hard enough. And I think he was absolutely right about that. But so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a very materialist explanation. But that's not to say that religion is not incredibly important in this story. And the most convenient thing for me, and this occurred to me when I was trying to, when you're writing a book, as you know, the bulk of your time goes actually not into the research or the actual word crafting, it's the organization of how, what sequence am I going to put these things in. It would have been so much more convenient for me if the Protestant Reformation had happened after 1600. It would have just made it much tidier, but it didn't. And because the reason it didn't is, in England in the 16th century, nobody knew they were part of my book. Nobody could foresee where this was going or anything. You do what you do, and stuff happens all the time. And so I think the way the Protestant Reformation factors in is that it happens for causes that are not directly connected to, not directly driven by this larger geographical, technological, governmental kind of movers, but then feed very much into it. And so, you know, Henry VIII leaves the Roman Catholic Church because he wants a divorce. He's got a younger girlfriend and he wants to have babies with her. It's that simple. That's what he wants. He has nothing. He's not sitting around with Cardinal Wolsey talking geopolitics, or what, I mean, he is, but not directly in connection with this. And so he gets his, when he can't get his divorce, which again, this is one of the sort of painful things writing this book, he really should have got that divorce. The Pope's had, you know, we often think Catholics, oh, you can't divorce. Sure you can. If you know the right people, this is not a problem. The great problem became that successive popes thought they could get a slightly better deal out of Henry. Henry needs this divorce. He's going to be willing to give up all kinds of stuff to get it. So let us squeeze him like a rag and get everything we can for the church out of him. So they squeeze and they squeeze. And then it goes catastrophically wrong when the Pope gets captured in one of these endless wars in Italy. And suddenly the whole deal is off the table. And Henry is now trapped in a corner. And it just goes on, one miscalculation and misunderstanding after another. It is actually very like Brexit in that sort of journey. David Cameron, Henry VIII, neither of them wanted to exit the European Union of their day, but that's what both of them ended up doing. But so this all happens through this chain of accidents, and it could still have been reversed. I mean, like when England left in the 16th century, they actually do go back into the Roman Catholic European Union for a while, then come out again. You can go back and forth. I would say that actually the same is almost certainly true of Brexit. But once the English are out, it heightens all of their existing geopolitical problems, because they're now an international pariah. They've like voted, well, they haven't voted. Their king has decided they're going to become North Korea. This is really bad idea, and a lot of so many things. But now they're out, they need to make this work. And for a long time, the Catholic powers, they basically tried to seduce the English back into Catholic Europe, and they dangle all kinds of attractive suitors in front of Elizabeth, with the condition that she raises, Elizabeth I, of course, with the condition she raises the children as Catholics to take the throne. This goes on for a long time, but the English opt against doing that, and that, I think, this then feeds back into the geographical narrative, because all of these things, everything in history, the causal arrow runs both ways depending on what's going on. And now they've got to defend this Protestant thing against all these really, really angry Catholics. And of course, the Catholic Europe, it's a bit like the EU after 2016. England must be seen to suffer for what they did, because there's all these other leavers all over Europe, Sweden, German states, the Dutch, they're all leaving as well. England must be punished, they must suffer for what they're doing. So it feeds back into the story, and the religious side becomes one of the big drivers of how this story then plays out, because you get this nightmarish situation in Scotland where the royal family, Mary Queen of Scots, ardent Catholic, and yet a lot of the population is ardently Protestant. And then this complete mess in Ireland, where the sort of Catholic Protestant thing, it's not that much of a big deal at first, but it becomes one when the London government starts sending a lot of Scots over there to settle down and create plantations, as they called them in those days. So yeah, I think I mean, I remain convinced that we are dealing with a very materialist story here, but as always happens, the idea stuff feeds back into the story. They sort of feed off each other.
Yeah, and there's no necessary contradiction between one or the other, I think, Ian. But bringing back onto the question of separation from the continent and the way you've described it, could I just put forward, not a counterfactual, but at least a a kind of fairly obvious point if you know the history of the so-called English monarchy, which has probably never been English at all. I mean, after all, it was started by the French. It continued under the Tudors, and I lived in Wales for 7 years, and anybody knows about the history of Wales knows that the Tudors come from Anglesey, the Tudur. And then we had Scots on the throne, the Stuarts. And well, then we moved to the Dutch, that's very continental, to the House of Orange, William. We then moved to the House of Hanover. And finally, of course, we end up with another German, a German dynasty, the Saxe-Coburgs, until they decide to change their names in, I think, 1918 to the House of Windsor because of World War I. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at, Ian, I get your point about the separation and the divorce. I mean, I think that's, and we'll explore that a bit more in terms of the role of empire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how that separates the UK mainland from mainland Europe. I get that. But how is it, therefore, that that the British or the English, whatever you want to call them, are constantly having to resort to Europe, to European monarchs, in order to fulfill to make somebody on the throne of these islands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say I would say that there's sort of two different stages in this story. And
yeah,
the first part of the story, you know, England and other parts of the British Isles as well are in no way unusual in regularly getting monarchs from the continent. There's just a lot of movement in that ruling class. And this is one of the great differences, I think, between modern states and pre-modern ones. Yeah, explored so well by your former LSE colleague Ernest Gellner back in the days when he was you know, pre-modern states. The ruling elite tends to see itself as utterly separate from the people it rules and has all these rituals designed to create this distance. And one of the best ways to do that is your rulers actually speak a foreign language. And so, you know, when William the Conqueror comes over, of course he speaks a foreign language, he's a foreigner. And his successors, gosh, I forget now the precise periods, but like for about 200 years, these guys primarily speak French, the monarchy. They spend the bulk of their time on the continent. And this, of course, makes complete sense because England, it's like, I mean, if you look at British history is part of European history in this period. It's just an extension of continental history. And it's geographically driven so that England, the south and east, the parts nearest to the continent, which are also the richest soils, the best agricultural weather, largest populations, greatest sophistication and wealth, greatest military power, but in all of those ways, greater than the rest of the Isles, but lesser than what's on the continent. And English history is basically about what comes its way from the continent. And Welsh, Scottish and Irish history is basically about what comes their way from England. You've got this sort of gradient, so ideas, microbes, missionaries, conquerors, all these things move from southeast to northwest. And so it's nothing weird or surprising about the fact that medieval, early modern English history is so dominated by European rulers, or that so much of their policy is about trying to figure out how do we deal with these greater powers on the European continent. One thing that gets a little weirder is that once they've made the separation, they stick with the continental ruling families. And here on this, I really would say, well, I think accident just has an awful lot to do with this.
yeah.
Now, of course, you know, we get the Dutch in 1688 because they're invited in by people who want to defend the Protestant faith against a sort of Anglo-Scottish king who has just become a Catholic. So they bring in, they hold their noses basically, bring in a Dutchman who actually does have, William does have a pretty good claim on the throne in his own right, but he marries the heiress who, once they fabricate this story that James II has abdicated, she's now on the throne. So they get the Dutch lot, they again hold their noses and put up with that. Then they get the Germans because the alternative might be to go back to the Anglo-Scottish Catholics, and that, at least for one faction, that is absolute anathema. You cannot do that. So now they're stuck with these Germans. And because everybody initially hates the House of Hanover, they're constantly rioting against George I, who steadfastly refuses to learn any English at all and spends every minute he possibly can going back to Hanover because he just detests England. And it takes, so we get to the great King George III, who, if you haven't read Andrew Roberts' new recent Asking of America, you really should. Great book. You get George III finally starts to say he sort of likes England and he will now learn English. So we go down this path of Germans. But the interesting thing is that by the 18th century, it kind of doesn't matter anymore. People stop being quite so worried. They still will dredge up sometimes the foreigners thing, but they stop being quite so worried about this. And of course, by the time you get to the changing the name to Windsor, World War I maybe makes the antagonisms a bit sharper again. But yeah, I'd say two big phases, and one driven by very much by geography, the other one a bit more accidental.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Ian. That's a great discussion to have, actually, is it not? But of course, each of those monarchical groups, from the Hanovers through to the Saxe-Coburgs, had one thing in common. Apart from the fact they spoke German better than English in many cases, they were also good Protestants as well. Getting back to that, but it's not. Let's move on to your phase two, which in a sense I put it basically. This is the moment that the British go out, look round the world, it becomes empire of trade, empire of conquest, to the Americas first and foremost, obviously, and then to Asia. And I just like you to tease that one out a bit more. How much then does British identity or notions of identity of Britishness and geography start to think that Australia is almost closer than France? I know this sounds a bit strange for anybody to hear me say that, but brought up in a household as I was, rather conservative one in the southeast of England, I point out. I think my father always thought that, Australia and New Zealand and Canada were closer. Now, not closer, but I think that may illustrate your point. For my father's generation, born in just before the First World War, the notion of where geography lay and where geography was important, he never thought about continental Europe at all, but he did think about the Dominions, even South Africa to some degree. And I think, does that not also bring your point out about geography and meanings of geography and how people had ideas of geography, and these were far more shaped ultimately by empire and what empire achieved or didn't achieve over the next 300 to 400 years?
Yes, yeah, I think actually, give me 1 second. The dogs are just getting a little agitated here.
Oh dear, I've upset the dog, I hope, or not. I hope not, rather.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
All this talk about empire has made your dog go anti-imperialist on us.
No, they're going to carve out their own empire, I think. So I mean, around about 1500, actually the date I use in my book as a sort of cutoff between the first and second phases in the story is 1497. And pick that because it's the year that John Cabot, who, because nice English name, wasn't that English at all, he was Venetian, Gabotto his name was, he settled in Bristol. John Cabot sails to Newfoundland. Proving, although nobody actually knew he proved it at the time, proving that Britain is not actually the edge of a map focused on Europe. Britain is part of a larger map. The Atlantic is at its center. And of course, it took them quite a few decades to figure out that Newfoundland was Newfoundland. Cabot was convinced it was Japan. But so the British gradually discover as the 16th century goes on that they are part of this larger world. This new strategic vision starts to emerge, close the channel, open the oceans, engross the trade of the world. 17th century, very contested. By the 18th century, though, it's sort of really become established as this is the British place in the world. And I think I mean, there's a lot of history got talked during the Brexit debates. One of the sort of enduring confusions, I think, in that discussion was this assumption on some quarters that the period from about, say, 1713 to 1914, 200-year period out of a 10,000-year story, this was sort of the default state of the British Isles. You just kept those nasty continentals out of our business. We will default back to the center of the world. We will become the global power again. And that, I think, is just a very, very confused reading of history. These 2 centuries tend to dominate our accounts because they're, in many ways, the golden age of British success on the world stage, but a very, very short period made possible by this very specific set of technologies and organizational structures that change the meaning of the map in a certain way. And really, I mean, your parents were not delusional to talk about Australia and New Zealand, Canada being closer to Britain than France was, and a lot of people did, including some of the leading strategists of the day. They, the leading politicians would actually come out and say this. We should think of Canada as we think of Cornwall. They're so much closer to it because the ocean travel has become so much easier and so much more secure than it used to be. The British in the 19th century after Trafalgar could just take it for granted the channel is permanently closed against anybody who we don't want to see crossing it. So yeah, this makes absolute sense. And initially, because initially empire is all about the 13 colonies in North America, the US. And then that all kind of goes pear-shaped. But it coincides with the success of the East India Company, success from the East India Company's own point of view in gobbling up large parts of India. And again, you get explicit discussions in Parliament about how a new Indian empire is replacing the old American empire. Bits like Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa, frankly, nobody gives much of a stuff about these for a very, very long time. South Africa a bit, because the Cape is obviously strategically important to getting into the Indian Ocean. But the rest of them, British politicians are kind of embarrassed by Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Australia especially, the only thing they think to do with it is dump convicts there. And it takes a long time before, I mean, really getting up into the 1870s, before some politicians and strategists start saying, oh, wait a minute, we've got all these white settler colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where the population is booming. Australia is no longer a penal colony. These places are turning into phenomenal economic successes. What if we have another strategic upheaval on the same scale as what happened under Queen Elizabeth I? Rethink the entire map of the world, drop all this nonsense about free trade with everywhere on the planet, drop all of our concerns about keeping the continent at such a distance, but basically remake Britain around what they called imperial preference. We'll bring Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, few other places into this customs union. And this will make Britain basically the same thing as the USA, but better. And there's a great historian at Oxford, a guy named James Bealick, who wrote a book called Replenishing the Earth, which he has with this map in it that I borrowed his map for my book, where he shows like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand have been towed across the oceans and physically put into place next to Britain. And he talks about all of the similarities that would have made if you could sort of institutionally do that between a greater Britain and the USA. And it's just very, very bold vision. Ultimately gets defeated at the polls in an electoral fight. Very bold vision of what a British world could be like.
And an interesting point there. Joseph Chamberlain, of course, plays a big role in that. And they're actually the first two without being too parochial here, but the first two directors of the LSE, Hewins and the famous Halford Mackinder, I think, certainly shared that imperial vision of kind of Greater Britain at the very heart. And of course, in the 1930s, as the Depression hit down, one moved back to a kind of an imperial preference, so it kind of never went away. Free trade held its own until the First World War and until the Depression. Moving it on, though, if we could just do it in a very short space of time, namely just 100 years or so, a mere tick on the back of that animal we call history. What changes, therefore, in the 1950s and 60s? Is it the decline of empire, or is it the appeal of Europe grows, or is it both? Because it seems to me, and it may be too simple to say this, Ian, as the notion of empire as the center, the British Empire as the center of the world and Britain at the center of that imperial world begins to fold up, 47 India, 60s, 50s, 60s through Asia, and through India, the first independent country, Ghana and Africa, etc. As that notion of imperial power goes, and the Suez Crisis, of course, was another manifestation of that in the Middle East, it's at that point, is it not, that the British political elite or class, or some of them, start to look back and start to look across the channel after 500 years back to Europe. Now, is that overly simplified, or do you think that's a reasonable way of bringing us into phase 3 of your views about the relationship between Britain and the continent, Ian?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, I think that Britain starts to begin the third part of its story, move off this map where Britain is the center. Basically, everything changes in a sense because nothing changes. I think what happens is the same forces that had closed the channel, opened the oceans, propelled Britain to the top of the heap, the same forces simply carry on operating. So technologies keep changing, organizations get bigger and bigger and more sophisticated. And you go from sailing ships to steam ships to airplanes to jet airplanes and telegraphs and submarine cables and the internet. All this stuff just keeps changing, doing what it's been doing since before 1500, which is shrinking the world. And in the 17th, 18th centuries, as the world shrinks, well, initially when the world starts shrinking, it's the Spaniards who take most advantage of this, of their American empire, global empire they start creating, but then the British beat them off the top of the hill and take charge of it for themselves. As we go through the 19th century, the world is shrinking. The British are facing new challenges again, as they've been doing constantly the entire time. All this guff that some British politicians came up with about splendid isolation. Splendid isolation was only ever maintained by furious diplomatic activity. Britain is always deeply involved with the rest of the world, always facing challenges. But as the 19th century goes on, by, I'd say about the 1860s, it's become clear that great mountains of money have now arisen in North America and in Western Europe, particularly the US and Germany, largely because of the global system the British have created, in which the Americans and Germans are trading. And as these great heaps of money rise up, the Americans and Germans become potential rivals to push Britain off the top of the pile. And Britain manages to see off the German challenge by fighting the two world wars. But the only way to do that is by putting Britain under the wing of the mixed metaphor here, under the wing of the American mountain of money. And this is very clear to them. Already in 1916, there's this great cabinet minute saying, by the end of this summer, the president of the American Republic will be able to dictate foreign policy to His Majesty's government if he chooses. They realize they're doing this, but they recognize it as the lesser of the evils confronting them. And I mean, one of the strange historical ironies is, of course, the two world wars are fought against Germany primarily, and yet it's, in a sense, it's not Germany that's the real enemy here. That Britain is simultaneously fighting like a financial war, fighting at boardrooms and stock exchanges, not battlefields, and the Americans win that overwhelmingly. So that by the end of World War II, I mean, you've still got plenty of old-style imperialists, people who are bitterly opposed to withdrawing from India in 1945, but they are more and more broadly seen as simply living on a different planet from everybody else. And there's simply no way for the British to hold on to that position. And Anthony Eden, who engineers the disaster of the British intervention in Suez, Eden, at least after the Suez catastrophe, Eden is very explicit about this. And he says, well, Suez, that was not so good. But that doesn't actually reveal anything new to anybody. We all kind of knew already. This just underlines the fact that Britain is no longer the global player that it was. And this is, I think, absolutely what lies behind the pivot back toward Europe. That when Macmillan pushes Eden out of the premiership in a very underhanded way, Macmillan takes charge. And I mean, when I was growing up, Macmillan, because he was still, I think, still Prime Minister for the first year that I was alive. And he was just like this standing joke. Everybody made fun of, fuddy-duddy old Harold Macmillan with his droopy moustache and his Guards accents, all this stuff. But he was actually a very, very deep-seeing strategist. And he goes through this long internal discussion within government over what the heck are we going to do. And he recognizes that Britain can only maintain its position as basically as America's lapdog by realigning itself back to Europe, because that's what makes Britain so valuable to the Americans in the Cold War environment. And so Britain must pivot back toward Europe, only to discover, of course, the Europeans don't want us because we've been so mean to them since the end of the war. So it doesn't go so well. But I think that, again, Macmillan understood how the geography had changed its meaning. And there's this famous line, 1962, Dean Acheson, the American Secretary of State, rather unkind comment. He says, Great Britain has lost an empire and not yet found a role. And it's unkind, but it wasn't untrue. And I think ever since the end of the Second World War, basically, Britain has been trying to work out what is the best role for it on a stage, a map that's changing so rapidly.
No, all of that makes absolute sense to me. I mean, Macmillan also made that famous speech about Africa, The Winds of Change, which went down very, very badly with the imperialist wing of the Conservative Party. But nonetheless, again, he understood, and in the same way he understood the relationship with the United States as being absolutely crucial. This is why he got on so well with Jack Kennedy, which was quite important during the missile crisis. And your point, just to go back on a point you made earlier on, that very famous 1916 memo to the British cabinet, that we're now becoming totally dependent on the United States financially, that was actually on the basis of a draft drawn up by none other than John Maynard Keynes, who was working with the Americans at the time on the finances. And he said, look, we've run out of money, basically. We can't continue this war.
without the American finance. And it's, in a sense, it's better to have a subordinate financial and political relationship to a country with which we can get on with, which doesn't declare war on us, than one that we can't get on with so well at the time, Germany. But then that brings me maybe to the final part of my questioning, Ian, or that conversation we're having. Do you think the British, whatever that phrase means, and as we've seen, it can mean a multitude of things. Does it include the Welsh, the Irish, Northern Irish? Which Northern Irish? Does it include the Scots? Of course it does. And that's therefore not a single form. Did the British really ever accept emotionally Europe as something they wanted to be part of? I mean, straight away after Heath, who was a very in a sense, almost, I wouldn't say left field, but not a typical Tory leader, really, in many ways. You know, he wasn't from the aristocracy. He clearly wasn't a Thatcherite. It's kind of an interim, interesting figure in many ways. Nonetheless, as soon as he does it, he gets driven out of power by strikes, actually, essentially at home. And then the Labour Party immediately calls the referendum. Now, admittedly, the referendum was won by a massive landslide, 2-1 almost. But nonetheless, it seems to me that it raises immediate questions. And then you get to Thatcher, a different kind of reaction to Europe. But again, Thatcher planted seeds, although she accepted Maastricht, accepted much of Europe, and indeed did a lot of renegotiations with Europe, which really annoyed the Europeans, as you well, and really annoyed the EU. But I suppose that raises that bigger question, Ian, is whether you think the Brits, let me just use that phrase, really accepted Europe emotionally in that existential sense, in the same way that maybe France has, or Germany has, or Italy has, different experiences of the war, different experiences of the US relationship, different experiences of empire. I kind of have a feeling the Brits never quite emotionally kind of accepted Europe, but that's a big generalization, big question. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to that. I think when Britain, the surprising thing to me is how little anguish and debate there was within Britain in the run-up to joining. Tory leaders start talking about this in the 1950s. Harold Wilson is banging on about it, makes multiple attempts to join in the 1960s. Goes on into the 1970s. Politicians were upset about this, but hardly anybody else was. There's this wonderful cover on an edition of Private Eye from, I think it's like 1967 or so. So one of the sort of later attempts to join. I was going to use it in the book, but it turned out to be too complicated to arrange all the copyright stuff. But it says, it's got this headline saying, Europe, the great debate begins. And there's a picture of a group of people sleeping in the sun in deck chairs. And I think that just really perfectly captures this general lack of interest in what is going on. And I think there is something to what some of the Brexiteer politicians were saying in the 2010s, that the joining the European Union was sold to people in Britain as is a little bit glossed over what was actually involved in this. So this really involved major reconfiguration of sovereignty and identity. This was going to be a big deal, and it really wasn't presented as a big deal. And certainly growing up in Britain, a teenager when we joined the EU, just like that, I always thought the EU is just the most boring topic imaginable. The minute it came on TV, you change the channel, I'm trying to football on a different channel. And now it seems like the EU, in a way, is the boldest political experiment since World War II in the whole world, but it certainly didn't seem it at the time. And so I think it took a while for it to sink in what it really was. I think it only really sinks in after the end of the Cold War, when I think a lot becomes more clear then, and becomes clear that the sort of strategic vision, what Macmillan had in mind in his vision, I think begins to become clear, that Britain is America's gateway to Europe. That's all. And that, I think, was a bit of a shock for people. That Britain, because it has such a different modern history from the European continent, above all, because of World War II. We're not completely defeated by the Germans. We're not occupied by the Germans. We don't have that experience. And so that gives British people a different perspective on relationship to Europe. But then also, the thing about empire, I was actually a little surprised to realize how very cynical British leaders and the general population had always been about empire. I tended to think of it as either this emotional thing where people hated and are ashamed of Britain's imperialist, racist past, or this sort of jingoistic emotional thing. Again, yeah, this was our greatness. Really, throughout the history of the empire, overwhelming, the attitude seems to have been, hey, if this works for us, let's do it. If it doesn't, let's stop. And leaders who I was sometimes surprised by on the right, who were just very, very cold-eyed about the whole thing. And Winston Churchill, who you don't think of as a sort of post-colonial kind of guy on the whole. Winston Churchill in 1922, Churchill says, well, okay, all these Irish, terrible Irish people are all giving us a lot of trouble, making us look bad with the Americans. We can crush them by brutal repression, but they're not worth it. It's not worth it to us, so let them go. Any part of the empire that's not worth keeping, let it go. And of course, Churchill famously did get very emotional about India, but when it push came to shove, he did nothing to try to stop Britain getting out of India, because it was a terrible idea to try to stay in India, well, maybe a little bit longer than they did, but for much longer than they did. And yeah, I was surprised just how cynical the British people as a whole seem to have been about the empire.
Cynical about empire, and I think that's an important point, because quite often you find today that I often get asked questions by excellent students here at the LSE, of course, goes without saying, you know, is Britain suffering from kind of post-imperial blues, kind of hankering back to the great days? And I kind of think from my own experience, which is not everybody's, I confess, obviously not, but I kind of I don't get that at all. I mean, Britain has nostalgia about anything. I suppose it's about 1940. You know, that moment, you know, when Britain stood between totalitarianism, which was fairly reasonable thing to say, and freedom. You know, I think that was a moment. I think 1966, when, you know, England won the World Cup, is kind of sits in the memory quite a lot. But I genuinely don't feel, I'd be interested to get your feel, that there is, well, you've been living outside this country for a very long time, I know, but you're still British, obviously, but I just don't get that sense of a post-imperial nostalgia. And indeed, the one politician in Britain who expressed that most, and then he did it in a very racialized way, of course, was Enoch Powell. And, you know, he got slung out of that cabinet as quickly as possible by Edward Heath. And any British politician today who comes up with some kind of uncritical defense of empire or the imperial moment, particularly now in the whole debate about slavery, you know, I think it would just be laughed out the room. And you're coming back to me, and your dogs again.
Yeah,
noise off stage. That's my feeling. The British have never been overly, you know, fussed. Maybe we're underestimating fussed about what has gone, and equally, as you point out, we're not desperately fussed about Europe either. Even if you look at public opinion polls, before Brexit final vote came in, June 2016, on the list of priorities ordinary British voters seem to have, you know, Europe was about third or fourth, if I remember very well. So I'd like to get your take on that as well, Ian. And try and bring in some other questions too from other people.
Yeah, I mean, because I was growing up in the English Midlands in the 60s and 70s, when the high point of decolonization, and it just wasn't on the radar. I mean, you know, as a kid, I wasn't really worried about much of anything about football, but you know, most of my elders were worried about things like inflation, unemployment. Yeah, I mean, what was going on the other side of the world just didn't seem to register all that much. And people, certainly the people I knew who did go sort of banging on about empire and stuff, most people thought they were nuts, that they was just so disconnected.
Yeah.
From everything else. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the same with Europe. I think this is why it just always seems so incredibly dull when it came on TV. But I think the European part of the equation, at least, I think it changed very much in the 1990s when Britain's position on the American map of the world began to become much clearer to people. But then also, I think in the 2010s, there were these very visible failures of the European Union in dealing with things like Greece and the Euro crisis, with the Syrian refugees coming across the Mediterranean through the Balkans, and then the Ukrainian crisis, the 2014 Ukrainian crisis, as opposed to the new one. Very visible failures on the part of the European Union, which really fueled people who thought Britain should get out of this European Union for whatever their reasons were. And I mean, I suggest in the book, my big storyline is about how geography drives everything, changing meanings of geography, and the position Britain got itself into by the 2010s have been driven in large part by the rise of these North American and West European mountains of money. But I suggest that the really big thing, which I think has also slightly escaped the notice of a lot of people in Britain, is that since the late 20th century, we've seen the rise of this third mountain of money, which I would now say is the most important thing in the world, which is the East Asian mountain of money. That increasingly global politics is becoming about how the rest of the world, the West as a whole, deals with the East. And it's like, I would say that the tragedy of Brexit was not that one side won, the other side lost. The tragedy of Brexit was that Britain was drawn off into arguing about Europe for half of a critical decade, not thinking all that much about China. Because the 21st century is not going to be about Brussels, it's going to be about Beijing. And I think when historians look back on the 2016 referendum, the question they're going to be asking is, was that a good thing or a bad thing in terms of Britain's position in the world relative to China? That is what we're going to be asking in the future. And that, I think that is why I think going down that rabbit hole of these deep arguments, unsealing these wells of hatred over Europe, this was such a mistake.
I agree with that. And it's an interesting question, the rise of Asia, particularly the rise of China within, and to some degree it must be said, although at a lower economic level, reduced economic level, India as well. But part of the Brexit argument, I remember very well, and I've gone back over and double checked this just to make sure I've got this right, Ian, is that in a sense, geography, going back to your theme of geography doesn't matter any longer in a globalized world. That in a globalized world, connectivity, connections, speed of transportation, the new kind of world economy we're living in means, therefore, that it really fits into your argument. I'm not saying you agree with the conclusions, but it kind of suggests that it doesn't really matter where our major trading partners are, because in a globalized world, we're close to everybody. And I think it's all very, very interesting the way that the notion of geography was used, actually, interestingly, by the Brexiteers to say it no longer matters. Now, if you talk to economists, let me just, without quoting anybody here at the LSE, but let me just use the generic term economist, they kind of think that geography matters quite a lot in terms of costs of trade, who you're close to, and who has historically been your biggest trading partner, at least until recently. So how does that geography question fit into the Brexit debate, you think, Ian?
Yeah, I think everybody who says geography doesn't matter should go to Ukraine. In Ukraine, you will discover geography really matters.
That's a great deal, yeah.
I will say, given the choice, never live in a country whose name means borderlands. That's always going to go badly. I mean, Ukraine has been fought over by just everybody in Eastern Europe because it's the intersection of all these different geographical zones. So yeah, I think this basic story in the book is how the changes in technology and organization have changed the meanings of geography. And that story, I mean, the story is going faster than ever now. And I think this is why, what gives some plausibility to saying that geography hasn't lost its meanings, but this longer story of the world shrinking is going faster than ever now. And here I am sitting 6,000 miles away from you, we're having this conversation.
Actually,
it seemed like magic 50 years ago. But so yeah, geography, the world is continuing to shrink, and that is changing what the geography means, but it certainly has not ruled it out altogether. And in fact, in the book, toward the end of the last but one chapter, I get talking a bit about, well, so what would a world in which Britain were to sort of move toward China, what would that world look like? And I think for Britain, that world would look very different than it does for places that really are next to China, like Hong Kong, like Xinjiang, like Tibet. They know what it's like to be right next to a dictatorial power. Whereas I think the experience of Britain on the other side of the world in a Chinese-dominated world might not be what anybody in Britain should seriously want to have, but it would be very different from if you actually lived right next to China. So sure, yeah, geography is losing a lot of its meanings, and the ones it's got are changing, but we're a very long way from geography having no meaning.
No, I entirely agree, but it was an interesting way in which the issue of geography and meanings of geography
were used by the Brexiteers. I remember Fox himself kind of used that argument quite a lot to kind of say, well, look, it doesn't really matter. And moreover, and this was another interesting question about where geography, economic geography was becoming more important. And the argument, again, and it gets back to geography and economics very closely, that Europe was, in a sense, you didn't say it, but it was implied, that the center of the world economy is shifting geographically away from the transatlantic, away from what we once called the West, away from Europe. It's a kind of it's a kind of long-term relative decline of the, let's call it the West in geographical terms, and it's moving towards the East. So I think here again, the issue of geography and meanings and understandings of geography, I think impinge very, very directly and importantly in the Brexit debate. The question, and I'd like to get your thoughts on that. The question is then, were the Brexiteers right or wrong, do you think?
Again, I think resounding yes and no.
Thank you for that.
They were perfectly right to identify the strategic issues that they did. That there's nothing natural about the British Isles being politically involved in the European Union. It's not a natural state of affairs, and there are other ways to think about the world. And there are strong arguments for some of the other possible arrangements that were out there. Now, having said that, I do think that Brexit was a mistake. I think if we do judge it the way I think we should in terms of what does it mean for Britain's position in the world relative to the growing might of China, I think divorcing ourselves from one of the great economic blocks on the planet in 2020, this was sort of a bad idea. And I think there will be a price to pay for that. There's this famous line from, I think it's 1803, when Napoleon, there's this guy Napoleon doesn't like, the Duke of somebody or other, and Napoleon has him kidnapped and brought to France and put on trial and executed. It's a judicial murder. And everybody in Europe is up in arms about this great crime Napoleon's committed. And one of his advisors said to him, oh, no, this was much worse than a crime. It was a mistake. And I think that is sort of applies to Brexit as well. The way it was discussed in 2016 was in, I think, very moralized terms. That this is a crime. It's a betrayal of our friends in Europe, or others were saying joining the EU in the first place was a betrayal of British values. It's presented very much in this rather moralized discourse. Well, I think we should be looking more just the sort of nuts and bolts of this. What is this going to cost? This is going to do, almost certainly going to do damage to the British economy. It is weakening Britain's place within Europe. It brings gains as well. What is the balance going to be between these two?
One question has just come up here from Ewan Grant. Thank you, Ewan. Interesting question on the Navy, actually, the end of naval supremacy due to economic rivalry and new technologies. I think that's a very interesting question for all sorts of reasons. One is that Paul Kennedy, your good friend of mine, Paul Kennedy, has just written a wonderful book on World War II and naval power, and also about the transition, the final transition, really, because it began in the 1920s, of course, of the rise of the United States naval power, the Washington Conference in 1922, and then the transition through World War II to the United States becoming the dominant global naval power. I know you're not a naval historian, but I'm sure you know a lot about it. Paul Kennedy knows a great deal about it in that wonderful book of his, which I really do want to advertise. Could you say something to Ewan's question on that? Was that inevitable, or as a result of simply the rise of the United States, or the two world wars, or how would you analyze that rise of naval supremacy and Britain's loss of the imperial power, the imperial service, the senior service, as it was always called? And also, for people who don't know it, it also even had a cigarette called Senior Service with a picture of a naval rating on the front. Not that I ever smoked, of course, Ian, no more than you ever did in your youth. Ian, over to you.
Yes, my granddad used to smoke those.
Senior Service. It wasn't about the naval, about the Navy, wasn't it? It's very interesting.
Yeah. So yes. I think that there's this great line. There's this guy, Nicholas Roger, who wrote this huge 2 volumes on the history of the British Navy. There's this great line at the beginning of the first volume, saying that trying to write a history of Britain without focusing on the Navy is like trying to write a novel without using the letter E, which I thought was just so good. He gets it exactly right. If you get interested in British history, you have to get interested in naval history. And well, Halford Mackinder, we talked about briefly earlier, founding father of the LSE, one of his big historical points was the big turning point in history, again, about 500 years ago, the world switches from a place where the great powers are great land powers on the Eurasian landmass to one where the great powers are great sea powers, able to use the oceans to project their power around the world. And Britain becomes the dominant global power by becoming a great sea power. And Britain ceases to be the dominant global power by ceasing to be the great sea power. It's a very straightforward one-to-one kind of correlation. And famously, you referred to the early 1920s, the day when the British Navy lost more ships than on any other day was in 1922 at the Washington Naval Conference, when we agreed to scrap half the fleet, basically, in return for the Americans agreeing not to go through with the naval build-up that Woodrow Wilson had started during the First World War. And the British go along with this basically because they know they're going to lose. If they get into an arms race with the Americans, they're going to lose. So why spend all that money and lose anyway? Well, we could save all that money and lose anyway. So yeah, I think there's a very tight correlation between the naval history and the geopolitical, geostrategic history. As of course, it makes entire sense. I think when the British agreed in 1922 to get rid of the bulk of the Navy, they were once again just being very rational and hard-nosed about this. They saw at the time that if we do this, it means we're no longer in a position to defend our Far Eastern colonies against any serious naval rival, by which, of course, they understood perfectly well this means Japan. So another clause in the treaty in Washington in 1922 that often gets forgotten about. The Americans insisted that Britain break its naval alliance with Japan. The only naval alliance it ever made in its whole history was with Japan. And Japanese took this really, really badly. And it's one of their many grievances for why they need to create their own empire in the Pacific, with the disastrous consequences this has. So yeah, it's a fascinating story. And the tentacles of the naval history just reach out into absolutely everying. But I think we do sometimes forget, we still have the British still have one of the world's leading navies.
Yeah, and actually, we recently had a discussion here at the LSE on the Elizabethan era, not the first one, the second one, between 1952 and 2022. And the point I made there, and others made other, I hope equally interesting points, was that even in the 1950s, Britain is still a significant military power in the world more generally. It spends a lot on defense. It still has a serious naval capacity. It can still reach out. It can go well beyond its own shores. And moreover, in 1952 develops an atomic bomb, which in the end it puts on submarines. So I think it's right to suggest, as Ewan does, this loss of naval supremacy, no longer the senior service, even if the cigarettes are still sold, but nonetheless still a significant, and as you point out, even today, this notion of projecting aircraft carriers, South China Sea, in the Black Sea, still not entirely, still disappeared altogether. Ewan, thanks very much for that. And I'm moving on to Peter Ballard. Thanks for the question, Peter. To continue along the materialist approach, would you say, that's you, Ian, not me, that the UK's comparatively limited economic gains within the EU had something to do with Brexit? In other words, I think Peter's asking, well, what did Britain really gain from Brexit? And these were limited economic gains, especially as other countries like Germany have gained far more by integration. In other words, it wasn't a massive economic benefit to the UK. And that'd be one of the materialist reasons why in the end, the British people, or 52% of the British people, decided they wanted to leave. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. That I think is a really interesting question. As one of the arguments for joining the EU right from the 1950s was, look how well the continental economies are doing. They're booming, leaving ourselves outside this huge market. This is a terrible thing, need to get inside it. And so finally Britain gets inside the market on January the 1st, 1973. And the economy just goes down the toilet almost immediately.
It wasn't a good decade, the 70s, if I remember.
Yeah, I mean, things have been going badly in the 60s. They go terribly in the 70s, and they sort of keep getting worse and worse and worse. And the sort of low point is really in the early 80s, an absolutely terrible time for the British economy. And that, I think, that did surprise some of the champions of Europe in the 1970s, but it really shouldn't have done. Because I think, I was talking up Harold Macmillan earlier, saying about how he was this laughing stock when I was a kid, but he actually was a sort of deep strategic thinker. But there was one enormous failing in Macmillan's approach to Britain's position in the world that he was told about over and over again by rivals. That there's two sides to this story. There's Britain's actions on a global stage, so jetting off to the Bahamas to talk to Kennedy and going to Moscow to talk to Khrushchev and all this sort of thing, and that's really important. But it's Britain's internal economic capacity is also a crucial part of Britain's part in the world. And Macmillan he was a brilliant political tactician. He dodged and weaved to avoid ever having to confront basically the internal decay of Britain's industrial potential. And that's what finally comes due in the 1970s. And of course, famously, for all of the abuse heaped on Margaret Thatcher about monetarism and other things after 1979, the Labour Party had already started going down that path before 1979. Callaghan and Healey committed very strongly to limiting the money supply, not creating inflationary pressures. And so it's like this train was going to hit the British that had been allowed to build up speed by Macmillan, then Wilson ignoring it. Something had to be done. Maybe didn't have to be done quite in the way Margaret Thatcher did it, but something had to be done in the 1980s. And it was really, I think, addressing those problems that allowed Britain's economy to start recovering and really performing quite well in the 90s and especially the early 2000s. And in 1998, Gordon Brown gives this speech. At the time, everybody applauded. He's still the Secretary of the Treasury then.
Chancellor.
He's still the Chancellor at that point. But he says, we have ended the stop-start cycle of Britain. We've created long-term sustained economic growth. And nobody was calling him a complete clown for saying that. Because 10 years later, he looks ridiculous. But at the time, that was widely believed. This has been achieved through membership in the EU and internal reforms within Britain. So I think the EU, joining the EU, created more opportunities for the British if they were willing to do the hard work to take advantage of them. Yeah. And one of the things I say in my book is this is the perennial story with geography. Geography is destiny, but it's up to us to decide what to do with it. And it was in the 16th century when the new technologies and organizations came along. It was in the 1970s and 80s after joining the European Union. It's not enough just to recognize what geography offers to you. You have to be willing to make the sacrifices that are sometimes necessary in order to exploit it. And my general feeling is that being outside the EU is going to be harder for Britain, economically at least, than being inside the EU would have been. But again, it's a question of, well, what are you going to do about that?
On the question of the EU, I just thought you mentioned Gordon Brown, of course, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was very orthodox in some regards as well. But on Europe, as you well know, he laid down the 5 conditions for joining the euro, which could never be fulfilled. In other words, he wanted to stick with the pound as the currency. And of course, there are many economists, again, a few at the LSE at the time, say, let's get into the euro, let's join the euro. But I've always thought, Ian, that there was a fundamental contradiction of joining the EU, signing up to the Maastricht Treaty, somewhat reluctantly, to be sure, but not joining the euro. And it kind of put a kind of a contradiction at the very heart of UK's membership of the EU by not joining up to the currency itself. Because as we all know, a currency is not just a currency, it's about identity. You can't imagine the United States without the dollar, etc. So I just wonder what you thought about that. And I've got another great question coming soon from Philip Watson on another question like the Commonwealth. But I'd just like to get your thoughts on why did we join the euro, and that would have, overcome that fundamental contradiction.
Yeah. Great question, because it in so many ways seems like such a strange decision. And I think it comes back again to what the EU is trying to do, that Jean Monnet and all these other guys at the start, they were very clear about what they're trying to do. They were trying to create a United States of Europe. And having a shared currency, as you say, this is absolutely a euro dollar of some sort, absolutely crucial to this to this attempt. But I think what makes the EU experiment so fascinating for the historian is basically what they're trying to do. This is state formation. You're forming a new superstate. Margaret Thatcher was absolutely right to call it that. You're forming a superstate, but you're trying to do it without doing what states do. Because state, by one of the most famous definitions, Max Weber, a state is an organization that exercises a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence. States are about violence, and in other states, the currency is maintained ultimately by the threat of violence. The government says this is the legal tender of the land. If you tinker with it, you do any bad things against the currency, we will take legal action with you, which is ultimately sanctioned by state force. The police will come with guns and take you away and throw you in jail. That's what's going to happen. EU says, we're not going to do that. And so it's like, you know, if in the US, if Texas decided it was going to revalue, lower the exchange rate of the dollar independently, you can't do that. There are laws to stop you from doing that. And if you ignore them, the army will come and stop you from doing that. In Europe, when the Greeks start sort of going off the precipice, nobody sends tanks down into Athens to stop this from happening. They don't send gunboats the way Britain did in 1850. A very similar situation, actually, to redeem Greek debts that didn't look like they could be paid back. Palmerston says, okay, we're going to send a gunboat. We send a lot of gunboats. We confiscate the Greek navy, in fact. We say, we'll only give you your navy back if you pay the debts back. And the Greeks miraculously find the money to pay off their debts in 1850. EU rules that out completely. That's what makes it such a fascinating organization, a great experiment. Is it possible to get tens of millions of people to agree to give up significant parts of their sovereignty and identity and hand over control of their prosperity to you, mobility, all of these things, without actually killing anybody? Can we do this? And by the 1990s, it was beginning to look like maybe the answer was no. And because this, I think, is ultimately behind the decision that Gordon Brown and others have made that Britain should not join the euro, because they didn't see how this could work without the apparatus that makes other monetary systems work. And of course, hindsight has shown that on that issue, Brown was probably right.
That's very interesting. I've got a question here from Philip Watson. Thanks, Philip. This, of course, came up a lot in the recent celebrations, commemoration of the Queen's 70th anniversary, about the Commonwealth and this emphasis on the relationship between the crown and empire, but obviously as empire segued into something else we call the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth held its very first meeting, I'm sure you remember, back, what, 1947? I think its first secretary, its first leader was actually none other than an LSE professor of international relations, the first one. Philip Noel Baker, there I get in another plug for the LSE and its impact on the world, a very big one, by the way, but more than some people understand. But nonetheless, the Commonwealth was seen as very important. I mean, it's in the international relations literature, particularly the American-dominated side, it's kind of not talked about. And I think quite a lot of IR people over here and elsewhere, maybe on the continent of Europe, okay, well, what's the end? I just wonder if it's not more significant in the historical imagination of geography as well. Whatever political, it's still there, and it's still functioning. And we got a lot of mentions of it last week in the period of celebrating the Queen's 70th year on the throne. So be interested to get your views on the Commonwealth. Thanks for that, Philip. Great.
Yeah, and the Commonwealth, because something like the Commonwealth begins to be important. I say in the late 19th century, when you get these ideas floating of imperial preference and working with the Dominions to create a new kind of British Empire. But yeah, I think the Commonwealth, it does get a slightly bad reputation, and it has done a lot of very good things in the world. Right after the war, there was a strong part of the feeling against cooperating with the Europeans when they started forming the coal and steel organizations. Part of the feeling for that was that, well, that would mean introducing these tariffs and trade barriers that would hurt our relationship. Commonwealth, and A, that is a betrayal of identities, we can't do that, and B, it's just stupid in terms of prosperity as well, because right after the war, Commonwealth trade is way up there with European trade. It's a major area of wealth generation, because that almost immediately, as the Europeans start rebuilding after the war, the proportion of Britain's wealth being generated by Commonwealth trade starts to go down as the proportion generated with Europe starts to go up. They start crossing over relatively quickly. And it's interesting looking at what Macmillan says about Commonwealth, because he's just the sort of guy, hero from the Battle of the Somme in World War I, guardsman, ultra orthodox Tory, just the sort of guy you would think to be all sort of sobby and warm-hearted about the Commonwealth. He's absolutely ruthless about them. He says, the Commonwealth, that is yesterday. We've moved past the Commonwealth now. throw them overboard. He has no hesitation in being willing to sign on to what the Europeans want and raise all these trade barriers. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, you do still get people who will talk about a sort of Commonwealth vision of the future, and people who personally, I hope I'm not offending half the audience here, but people I think are just very strange. And the people who talk about CANZUK all the time, it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK organization. And I've traveled, actually not much in New Zealand, but quite a bit in Canada, Australia, and Canada, Australia, and nobody there talks about these things. And the Australian Prime Minister referred to CANZUK as utter bollocks, he said, when this idea started to get floated, that we would get some kind of union between these countries. It's just so wildly unrealistic. And so I think the Commonwealth, it's an important organization. And when it was first founded, there was some hope in Britain that it could do all the things for Britain that the empire had done, but without the sort of military domineering kind of side of the empire. But it turned out that's just not how it works in the world.
You could argue that. I mean, I'm not going to make a strong defense, but just to make it, maybe bring in another point. You could say that even if the Commonwealth isn't as significant as some would claim it to be, and there's been this ruthlessness towards the Dominions and others, as you saw, we basically sold the New Zealanders and the Australians down the line when we joined Europe because we weren't going to buy their butter and cheese and their lamb any longer. All that is absolutely true. But isn't there another concept? And again, it's a very old-fashioned one. The notion of the English-speaking peoples. Now, again, I know that carries all sorts of imperial connotations, and lots of people don't like it. But another historian you mentioned earlier, Roberts, actually wrote a book about the English-speaking peoples. Whether you liked it or not is another question. But doesn't that still have some relationship to the reality of the world? In other words, speaking English. I mean, I'm not saying it's the best language in the world, the only language, clearly it's neither statement are true, but nonetheless, the question of linguistic power still is expressed, not just through the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth was a kind of site where English would still be spoken and it would constitute a form of power itself.
Yeah, yes, I think, and as you say, talking about the English-speaking peoples, often now raises people's hackles because it is so strongly associated with a rather extreme right.
I agree.
But again, as you say, it's not completely nuts. It's like a lot of ideas get appropriated by one section of the political spectrum and then become sort of dirty words to other people. There's no reason why English-speaking people should be a dirty word, dirty words. It's one of the things that makes life so easy for the educated classes in the British Isles is the fact that so much of the world speaks English. And people like me, I couldn't get hired in Britain, nobody would have me, so I moved to the US because I at least speak the same language as people here. That can be done. Whereas if I were French or German, I would have had to work a lot harder at it to join the English-speaking world. And so this is a huge boon for people, a huge boon culturally as well, because Britain, in terms of hard power, military and economic power, Britain is still an important power. Britain is still very much in the top 10, lower reaches admittedly, but still in the top 10. But in soft power and cultural power, in most of the indices, it tends to bounce around somewhere between number 1 and number 3 in the world. And if it were not for the potential that the language gives us to reach other people, there's no way we would be doing that sort of thing. But I think it actually also goes beyond that, that there is a sort of institutional legacies that are shared between Dominions and North American United States, and also just strategic interests that Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Canada, the US, all of them, their economies are based on a global order of free trade, free access to the oceans, free access to markets all around, almost free access to markets all around the world. And they all share this in common. Their military and intelligence organizations all have enormous amounts of overlap. And that's why they have these things they call the Five Eyes groups, where Australian, New Zealand, British, Canadian, and American intelligence organizations cooperate on sharing information. And there is a sense in which there is a sort of unity. It doesn't exactly overlap with the Commonwealth, doesn't exactly overlap with the Dominions either, because the US is such a big part of it. But a rather sort of, some would say, worrying part of this is in the early 2000s, one former Secretary of State in the US said, well, when it comes to getting into a fight, the only armed forces in the world that matter are the US and the UK. And he was then quickly corrected by his advisors, said, and the Canadians. And the Australians apparently don't make the list because there just aren't enough of them, the same in New Zealand. But there is a very real sense in which the military forces of these English-speaking peoples have a lot more in common with each other, and all to punch way above their weight.
Which is not exactly the same as the Commonwealth, but it brings up the whole question of language solidarity, if that's the right word. You mentioned also recently AUKUS itself, this relationship between Australia, UK, and USA on submarines, which is so annoyed the Chinese. I've got one final question for you. It's from Halima Dani. Thank you very much. It's really about the work of Brendan Sims and whether I'm sure you know Brendan's work as well on Europe and Britain and the rest of it. British Europe, Europe in Britain. I mean, I'm not asking you whether to criticize Brendan's work or not. It's just reflections on the work of others who you have found helpful and useful, I suppose. Brendan may be one of them, I don't know.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, because Brendan Sims's work is one of the things I found very, very useful in writing this book. And particularly, he had a book that came out in 2016. His timing was much better than mine. His book, Britain's Europe, it was called. And the argument being that Britain kind of has always been part of Europe. He liked to quote this Churchill line that Europe is where the weather comes from, Churchill would say. It's always part of European history, and that had Britain embraced the European Union faster, then it could have been, we could have talked about British Europe. Britain would have shaped these institutions, and they would have developed in ways much more favourable to British interests than the way they did go. And that Britain's Europe book, when you're writing a book and you're pitching it to a publisher and trying to persuade the publisher, this is going to be the best book of all time. If you get behind it and work for it properly, it's going to sell 20 million copies. And your goal in telling them this nonsense is, of course, the more profitable they think it's likely to be, the bigger the advance they will give you up front. Very materialist explanation here once again. But so they always ask you, though, so what are the rivals out there in the field? And like I mentioned earlier, the quantity and quality of scholarship on British history is just overwhelming. The book took me longer to write because I just was drawn into so many fascinating things. It was just huge amount of stuff. But the only book out there that really I felt did something a bit like what I was doing was Brendan Sims's Britain's Europe, because it goes all the way back. I mean, admittedly only very briefly, but he goes all the way back into like late medieval times. Talking about Britain's role in Europe. He concentrates very much on the 18th century onward, because that's his period of specialization. But yeah, that book I thought was tremendously helpful for the larger project. And then for specific things, his book, Three Victories and a Defeat, about 18th century Britain, that's a great book. And I mean, I found within history, I mean, like the LSE is really unusual. It has a department of international history, which very, very few places do. I wish more places did, but the LSE does. We certainly don't. And what I think makes international history such a useful disciplinary box to put things in is that writing books like this one, talking to my colleagues at my own university and at others, I found that historians and strategists, two professional groups, are both very, very interested in international history, but in utterly different ways. And for most strategists, international history is driven by a set of kind of timeless strategic principles. There is a science to understanding how strategy works. And the strategists will think in terms of the interests of great powers and a sort of global strategic game that is often rather independent of the actors playing it. It goes on, it started before them, goes on after them, and their strategic interests, and this is where the idea of a realist school, of course, comes from. Their strategic interests outweigh any other kinds of interests. Geography trumps everything ultimately. And the historians tend to look at it all through the lens of culture and individual agency and the decisions of individuals. And I find that if I go to a conference of strategists, I spend my whole time being the token historian saying, but what about Henry VIII or Cardinal Wolsey or whatever it might be? And then I go to a conference of historians, I spend my whole time being the token strategist saying, well, but what about geography? I mean, these things really matter. The stuff that Cardinal Wolsey actually couldn't do anything about. And I think Brendan Sims is one of the relatively few paid up historians who moves comfortably between these two spheres. And so yeah, his books are tremendously useful to me. But one of the painful things writing my own book was that submit the manuscript to my editor and the publisher at the end, and they're reasonably pleasant about it, but they say, this section at the end on further reading, that's got to go. That is like a quarter of the length of the book. And I still felt bad about it. So I was ignoring all these really good things I'd read. Then, of course, all these really good ones I knew about but hadn't got around to reading. So I really had to pare that down at the end, which is really sad. So I think, yeah, history and archaeology are two of the jewels in the crown of British scholarship.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's great. It's very interesting what you're saying. And geography more generally amongst the story, I'm not saying it's been downgraded, but I think it carries a kind of no dir for some people because it's so associated with the 1930s, Hitler and Lebens. I know it's rather than actually situating it as you do so brilliantly. We're going to bring the conversation now to an end. I really very much enjoyed meeting you again, talking to you again. I just want to make a couple of announcements if I could. We've got another meeting coming up, or an event rather, on the 27th of June, connected maybe, called the New Geopolitics of Trade. So that could be very, very interesting. We're doing a lot of events at LSE Ideas, Ian. We're continuing the great tradition, which you were part of. You are part of the great tradition, to use that old-fashioned phrase, and you contributed so much to the life of Ideas when you were here. I'm pity you're not over on this side of the Atlantic, but there you are. I can understand why you are where you are. You've taken us from Tacitus to Gordon Brown to Brendan Sims. You've reflected over centuries, not just a few hundred years, these mini little items of history, but over thousands, and Ian, that's great. Again, thank you for all the questions out there. We had a good audience asking some great questions. I'm sorry I didn't pick up on all the questions. No doubt the next thing for everybody to do is go and buy Ian Morris's book on Geography as Destiny. Ian, thanks again. Thanks to Dave Sutton for organizing this. Thanks to Ideas. Ian, thank you for continuing your relationship with LSE Ideas and of course with this wonderful school of which I've been a member now the last 20 years. So all the very best to you and best wishes to your dog as well.
Thanks again for inviting me back, and I hope to be there with you in person as soon as possible.
Well, we're looking forward to that, and we're very much looking forward to that. So again, thanks to everybody out there. Thank you to Ian. Thanks to Dave and the team at Ideas. Goodbye, everybody.
Well, thank you. Goodbye.
Cheers, Dave.